I did want to start today's session just by mentioning there's a pretty severe thunderstorm going on right now, and I have lost power, but there's a standby generator in this building. So there is some element of operational resilience going on. So if I disappear, that's why. One of the thoughts I had about this session before we move into the discussion is really around its tie-in to the previous sessions in today's summit, and taking some of the concepts and bringing them back into the reality of an enterprise or an organization. How do we put those into practice as we're establishing or sometimes even migrating from traditional business continuity into really a day-to-day operational resilience mindset? And I was reminded of a couple key components and I guess tenets that we really had established and adopted within the operational resilience framework process in the working groups. One of those being the fact that we as organizations aren't standalone organizations. We are part of a supply chain that has an impact on others, and others have an impact on us. And as was noted by Phil and others, just that cascading impact does have a major effect on organizations all the way down to the end user, whether it's an end user business or an end user consumer. I mean, cognizant of whether we're part of the critical infrastructure or not, obviously has an impact on whether we're one of the 80/20, and if we should be focusing a little bit more than others. The other concept that we really held to firmly from the beginning was, rather than bringing the system back up online and having that as a focus, is working from the impacted customer or counterparty back. And you'll see that really play out as Mark had indicated in walking through some of the path items. And a lot of you are familiar with those. We go through the 7 steps that are really headline path steps that then play into the individual 36 odd rules, and then the maturity ladder associated with each one. And then, of course, the implementation aids in order to really bring that down to the operational elements within the business to make sure that it gets implemented in-house. So with that, I wanted to separate this discussion into 2 sections, one of those being external landscape, and then pulling it in-house into the enterprise practice considerations, so really best practices that we're seeing out there. And today, and by the way, my name is Trey Maust. I'm chairman of Lewis and Clark Bancorp, executive chairman of a bank, involved in a fair number of initiatives advancing the banking industry as well as regulatory landscape. With me today are 3 distinguished panelists. We spent some time thinking about various elements that we wanted to talk about, and so I'll be calling on each as we go through the different topics. So David is Managing Director, Strategy, Planning, and Transformation at Wells Fargo, also chairman of the BRC, so definitely very well integrated into the Global Resilience Federation landscape. Brian, former Global CISO, current principal, Cybersecurity Services at KPMG. And then Dan's Managing Director, Head of Control, Strategy, and Innovation for Global Security at JPMorgan Chase. Welcome, gentlemen. Let's start with the external landscape. We just heard from Roger on some pretty severe and potentially impactful, depending on the footprint that each of the attending organizations experiences and is either geographically or logically placed. Heard some from a geopolitical risk, the nation state enabled threats and actors that are associated with each. Also, one of the concepts that Roger, I picked up on that Roger was covering was around focusing on, instead of getting carried away with the entire landscape of threats, really those most likely threats. And my first question really is around that. So some of those that come to mind, and I know in preparation for this, we had talked about the traditional cyber attacks as they've been advancing, but also mis, dis, and malinformation, the impact of artificial intelligence, and of course, generative AI is a piece of that. And finally, one of the more recent threats that we've been seeing surface is impact on telecommunication from underwater fiber optic cables being potentially tampered with or cut. So why don't I start with Dan, just get your thoughts on some of the broader geopolitical threats before we work downstream.
Sure. And thanks, Trey, for having me, and good to be with all of you. I think it's been a really great set of sessions today. I'm certainly taking some notes and learning from each of the previous speakers. I am also obliged to say at the outset that if I do manage to get any opinions across there, my opinions, they're not those of JPMorgan Chase. So just to get that out of the way. Look, I think each of the external kind of threat categories that you talked about, Trey, are significant and probably growing. And there's interplay between them, right? So we think about nation state actors leveraging MDM, leveraging mis or dis or malinformation through various media, but increasingly AI enabled as well, right? One of the objects of that is to foment unrest and to foment mistrust in, the institutions of Western democracies and the kind of traditionally the traditional world order, and no time is better for doing that than election season. So we now know the date of the UK elections. We've known for a long time the date of the upcoming US presidential elections. And when the conventions will be held and all that, and between now and then, I mean, there are obviously a number of protests going on, around the current unrest in the Middle East, around ongoing sort of activist groups that are more driven by climate change and other environmental considerations, all those kinds of things, and those probably on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis have even more impact on operations, at least in the U.S. and North America, and depending on, as you said, Trey, on the footprint of our different organizations, where we have operations in the rest of Europe and so forth, have as much impact as what might happen in one scenario or another with Ukraine or with Taiwan or so forth, right? So I think these things, these different categories interact with each other, but I guess the one that I'd highlight in addition to the several that you listed is kind of domestic unrest, whether that is, the kind of protests and demonstrations that are politically motivated, or whether it goes a little bit further into kind of domestic violent extremism, which is a top priority of government agencies and intelligence services as well.
Trey, you're on mute.
Well, that was
Thank you. That was not Operational Resilience Matter. We have an election cycle coming up, which certainly results in a propensity for those unrest and or activities to escalate. Do you see that impacting on? And I'd pose this to any of you, and David, I think you also had some thoughts around this. Do you see that as posing threats to organizations from an operational resilience perspective? I do recall some of the coming out of the financial crisis, targeting certain industries like the financial sector and banking in particular, having an impact on the ability to deliver services. So I don't know if you're envisioning something like that occurring as well coming up.
Yeah, I think let's look at it from a primary or face value impact, which is what was already mentioned. The concept of protest, the absenteeism, things like that. I think that those are, again, in your face, primary, known, and visible. A lot of redundant terms there. But I think you have the secondary view, which is what I'll call the silent protest, which is within firms, you may not agree with the stilt that the firm you're working for has, whether it be from a PAC donation point of view or publicly made sentiments. And you might have this silent protest, which is maybe all of a sudden you're garnering, because of those views, essentially an insider threat, whether it be small or big or what have you. But is there something sort of latent, that's being triggered by, again, the views that your firm may be taking? In 2008, during the financial crisis, anything that was associated with the financial sector, you were a banker, right? And there were people in the Northeast, and so I live in Connecticut, and between New Jersey and Connecticut, who there were problems. You take a train ride in, and if you were the standard wear in the financial sector is your fleece vest with some sort of name of your firm on the back, right? People stopped wearing those, right? Because they didn't want to be associated with being in the financial sector and being, a banker. So yeah, you have these silent protests, which then the tertiary effect, primary, secondary, tertiary effect is starts wearing down on the psyche of the individual too, that has to go ahead and do work. So I think that there are those impacts.
Thanks. What I'd like to do is start out at a very high level with the geopolitical and work to some of the more direct exposures and threats to our respective organizations. And I think one that has been a thread throughout each of the sessions today has been around artificial intelligence and the growing threat in I think several different facets, whether that's leveraging generative AI to circumvent identity and authentication-based defenses, or it's just being able to deploy and evolve bots and various software code in order to circumvent security that exists today. Social engineering, obviously the list goes on, and including some of the examples that were given, as much as the 25 million that was exfiltrated as a result of a Zoom call. And it certainly gets us focused on the potential evolution of those. Where do you think it ends? I think we're focused on the immediate, as Roger had brought up earlier, but the evolution over the next 5-10 years, where do we need to have our sights? And I'm only asking this question from the standpoint of we don't need to have that implemented today, but the potential for it to result in the need to invoke an operational resilience plan in order to continue operations from a minimum viable service level.
Yeah, doesn't it end with whatever the latest Terminator movie is, right? Isn't that the end of it? I mean, I think that those are very offensive views, as not offensive, but offensive views with AI being used for truly negative things. I actually worry more about the accidental, because I worry in many organizations and just as a hobby project, Mark Volin told me that I had to lead the AI working group under the Business Resilience Committee out of GRF. But I worry about the accidental, which is, are we getting ahead of our skis? I think a lot of organizations that are looking to employ AI, the basic hygiene principles that need to be stood up aren't there. And I wonder if that's just as dangerous as the deflecting from the offensive attacks. And I think that's problematic. We saw that a lot. I mean, we've seen it in different iterations. The thing that most comes to mind is the Internet of Things from years ago. Mm-hmm. And I'll use the physical security side. In the normal technology realm, people had stated procedures that were fairly well established for going ahead and standing up a box, right? So a box got stood up and these things happened. Well, on the physical security side, what we found was each door opener card reader had a Windows CE device. Mm-hmm. Which and I know for a fact, in many organizations, those things didn't go through the normal hygiene to go ahead and get implemented. And, a lot of those, whether it be cameras and things like that, all of a sudden were co-opted for compute power, even though they were tiny little Windows CE devices, right? So that's sort of the thing that I'm most concerned about from an AI point of view is there the accidental element that gets us to a bad place in the future?
So I think that leads really nicely into not just the concept of an operational outage or an impact from an incidental or accidental outage or negative impact, but just being prepared for any disruption too. So as Phil obviously had referred to, the all hazards impact. And it brings up I think from a segue perspective, the topic of third-party risk and supply chain. And I know in the financial services industry and banking in particular, third-party risk management is a very hot topic right now because of the increasing reliance upon those outside the firm to conduct activities on behalf of the bank and or financial services firm. And I'm curious, during the ACH exercise after action report, clearly that was one of the observations, a heavy dependence on third parties, not just for ongoing operations, but also, interestingly, for operational resilience preparedness. So whether that's backups, it's the recovery process, it's the alternate processing platforms, and then, of course, third-party risk management, including or involving due diligence and procurement considerations. And I'm curious, and maybe I'll start, Brian, if you'd like to comment on the third-party elements of this. And I did want to mention that when we think about the steps that are in the operational resilience framework, and I refer back to that because a lot of thought was put into this in order for it to be multi-sector and also across an entire supply chain. And that second step of understanding your place or your role in the ecosystem was put in there clearly for this reason. And then, of course, understanding once the alternate processing platforms or the methods of getting to either failure modes or bringing systems back up online or the ability to deliver services, all those being heavily dependent upon third parties in a lot of cases. I'm curious maybe how you and or your firm think about this with your clients across multiple sectors.
Yeah, that's a great question, Trey, because every client I'm in right now, including ourselves as KPMG, first topic we start talking about is third party, and it quickly transitions into fourth party as well, because the funny thing about that, sometimes third parties use a couple people and outsource. We've seen it in the data problem when there's a data breach. It doesn't happen at the third party; it happens at one of their suppliers. Because they don't do the due diligence. I'm seeing in a lot of manufacturing cases right now, they're very worried about production lines. It's around that if they can't keep production going, there's a semi-finished good they get from a provider. They have to bring it in. But the other aspect of that is not only, you're talking about parts and everything else, there's a lot reliance on software as a service right now. When you look at people providing cloud platforms, okay, so you may be still up, but if your platform goes out and it doesn't come up, I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges. I'll say this much: when Russia was getting ready to invade Ukraine, I actually had worked with one of my security vendors where we had software as a service, and I asked them, I said, "Will you help one of the parties? You're liable to be attacked at this pretty quickly. How do you help me keep this up? Because if your software as a service goes down, I'm blind all around." And they didn't have a good answer for that. I think the answer was red teaming. And I said, well, that's not a good answer for resiliency. So I think when you really start to look at it, whether it's the SEC reporting something around materiality of what that vendor means to you, whether it's the actual impact to revenue, because you can't get product out the door, because even if they can't, if that third-party supplier can't print labels for you, you can't put the product out. So it's not only is that detrimental, it's about you produced all this product, but it has to sit. And then I think the other part of it is just this: it's actually getting to know better. One of the challenges I'm seeing in very large organizations, they can't get down to what their critical vendors are. To drive what those operational requirements are. They have a hard time, is it a materiality issue? Is it a price issue? Is it, what they see from a provider? And so I think you're starting to see a lot of people grapple with that. Because, I guess another example for me that was hard was COVID. When COVID hit and everybody shut down, one of the hardest parts for me was actually trying to get our third parties able to keep running. We had to give, had to give them laptops. We had to have them go run out and do things. They usually came in the center. So I think we have to, one, continue to look at what critical vendors are and define what critical means in terms. Then I think second is we have to be working with them more in sort of exercises to look at the operational resilience, find where those breakpoints are. And I think that's the key for me. We all think we know what we're supposed to do, and everybody, but when things really happen, those playbooks. What does they say? Every plan's perfect till engagement of the enemy. So you've got to continue to do that with your critical vendors to keep your operations running, and that's what I'm seeing across most of our industry right now. There's a understanding, there's a bit of action, but they've got a way to go a little bit to really understand that concentric circle.
So David and Dan, the banking industry certainly has a very robust third-party risk management expectation for firms of all sizes. And Brian, your comment about it was very interesting to hear the comment about defining critical vendor or third party, and then by extension fourth parties, or the expectations around that. And then once those are defined and inventoried, really establishing an appropriate process for initial due diligence, ongoing monitoring and due diligence, et cetera, in ensuring that there is continuity and or the ability to continue to deliver services. David and Dan, anything just from lessons learned in the banking industry that might be helpful for other sectors?
I think that problem of defining your critical vendors is sort of the operational resilience problem in a nutshell, right? So who's going to determine which vendors are most critical? You have to kind of go traditionally, right? We go sort of group by group, who owns the relationship, who's sort of principally responsible for that vendor, that category of vendors. And so it's somebody in technology, let's say, who is prioritizing, which of our SaaS services, which vendors are the critical ones. And then something happens, and you see something like the platform for logins and authentications being down, and all of a sudden dozens of applications are out simultaneously, and scores of business processes are down simultaneously, and a whole company is looking at it and saying, what the hell is going on? Like, who's responsible for that? And it was somebody that nobody had thought of, because when you were kind of doing your resiliency planning, you had first fragmented it and distributed it to, well, these guys handle third party, and these guys handle technology, and these guys handle their respective business processes and stuff. And so, yeah, unfortunately, we still more often than not are going to learn the hard way when, an actual incident turns into a crisis or near crisis, that, well, we weren't as resilient as we thought we were because of, one of those links in the supply chain.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, David.
Sorry, Trey. Yeah, the calculus is hard, right? So, and what I mean by that is, if I think of, the normal BC world, business continuity world, folks would say out of the CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, obviously the BC folks are going to wear the giant, scarlet A on their shirt, right? And say, this is what's important to me. You start going over from a technology or a cyber or a CISO point of view, those things start blurring. Probably the one thing that we can all agree on is integrity of the data is really the issue, right? So yeah, this extended footprint in having the calculus so that you're not boiling the ocean is difficult. And one of my favorite ones for this is the Target breach from whatever it was, a whole bunch of years ago, where that wasn't even the primary, secondary, or tertiary. It was, I don't know what comes after tertiary, but it was the fourth tier vendor, right? It was the mechanical contractor's service company who downloaded a patch from the manufacturer. So it's really difficult to go ahead to figure out what that population is for the footprint. So I'm gonna take Brian's the expression he used. Mike Tyson did a better one, which is everybody's got a plan to beat me until I punch them in the face, right? So it's and to Dan's point, you never know until it really hits the fan, and you hope to be, frankly, my favorite expression these days, and I just had some challenge coins made up for folks on my team, which is we kind of hope to be mostly right in many of these situations, right? I mean, that's really it, because it's going to be that fourth party that's ultimately going to impact it.
But Trey, there's one more point I want to bring up here that I think we bypass a lot. One of my clients sat down and they were talking about critical vendors to me, and they said, "What do you mean I have 4,000 critical vendors?" He goes, "I can't afford 4,000 critical vendors." And I think the thing is, we thought about outsourcing and we thought about how that worked, and we got cost savings and we were able to do different things. Well, I do believe I love the idea when you guys are looking at the operational resilience, you got to look at total cost of ownership. Okay, the world has changed a lot in that perspective, right? And from a data perspective, from a transfer, from a product perspective. So, what I think it's going to be important in groups like us and groups like these is, how do you, and this is where AI becomes a friend, not a foe. How do you start to apply what I would call more real-time learning and abilities to create that list of your suppliers, okay, and bring real-time data in and not do it as a point-in-time operation? It's something we try to work on a little bit too, because we work with a lot of our customers where they've got 3,000, 4,000 these things and they're running out. And the question is, are you doing it off a spreadsheet that you looked at? Did you look up a BitSite report or risk recon? So it's taking those pieces, other information, to really start to massage and evolve your supply chain, because I do believe the supply chain is like a biorhythm. Some days are critical, other days they're not so critical. Some days they go back. And I think, it becomes back to what David said. We're placing bets, and we're going to place bets on certain things. And hopefully we're right 75% of the time. And otherwise, because if you try to do 100% across the board, you can't afford it. Just like in security, right? The cost of information security, I think there's this cost of the supply chain management and an operational resilience perspective. We just have to get better data to help place what I call educated bets.
Great point. I've got two more areas that I like to focus on for the external environment. One of those is a layer onto the third-party risk management, and that really is around, or just relationships, and that is around concentrations. And we're seeing concentrations in a variety of areas. And I think it was around a year and a half ago, Treasury issued their report on cloud providers and its impact on financial services. Most recent one, obviously, was around artificial intelligence. Just as a footnote on the artificial intelligence, the one area I wish they would have spent more time on was, I think, brought up by Roger, and that's around explainability. I think that's critically important, not just to know where could I get the data, but where did all this come from and how was the decision arrived. And so that's a side note, but as it relates to cloud service providers, as an example of concentration and the potential for, if everybody is utilizing it, not just for operations, so from a production standpoint, but also for resilience, does that, and I'm only using them as an example. I'm curious, are there other areas that come to mind where we're seeing concentrations of, say, third-party providers that those on the call should be aware of, just that they might not be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back, let's tie some discussion points together. Supply chain, right? I'm going to say this was 2009. I did a study for the Physic about concentration risk in componentry, data center componentry. And everybody said, well, we've got, X, Y, Z boxes in our place. But when you started breaking open the boxes, you see the same componentry within it, right? So I'm overusing already, but there's this secondary view of, just because you've got a Dell box over here or an IBM box over here, there's componentry in it. And so when I think it was Roger who was speaking in the prior session about understanding and maybe buying 2% extra stock, mm-hmm. It's not necessarily buying 2% of the extra boxes, right? It's maybe buying 2% more of the Hitachi drives that are in all these boxes, or a chipset that are in all these boxes. So I think that concentration risk, I think that the cloud one is the most novel right now, right? Everybody's interested in the cloud, and you know, the race to be the first people on, or the first companies on, and especially the financial sector. And I think that is an issue, and I think that there's ways to mitigate it from whether it be multi-cloud and using containers and stuff like that. But you know, we ran through the same thing with the telecom analysis probably, what is that, 15, 16, 17 years ago or something like. But yeah, I think it's all of those things. The question really is how you can differentiate. And I'm not sure that you can, especially if you're going to go to a single cloud provider. But we have a lot of those risks now, right? So you go in your shop, you're going to find big IBM mainframes, right? If you're sort of maybe behind the times, you've got some Unisys boxes around. I don't know. But you know, we've already put our eggs in a lot of individual baskets over the years. The question is what's the mitigation steps you can actually take?
Yeah, that's a great point. The you know, and you know, typically I was thinking about it in the context of technology service providers, and you reminded me that physical supply chain elements are just as important. And I was thinking about during the pandemic, we certainly saw that with chip shortages and the impact that had on automobile manufacturing. So not to mention just supply chain challenges throughout really multiple sectors. Dan, I think did you bring up, I'm trying to remember, did you bring up the concept of localized and friendshoring as it relates to concentration? Could you expand a little bit on that?
Sure. Yeah. So increasingly, if we've got, you know, operations in China for different reasons, in Russia, in Saudi Arabia, you know, in each place, the dynamics are a little bit different. But you need to kind of work with the local version of the cloud services provider, right? You need to have local suppliers, and some of that is driven by those regimes and what's required locally, and some of it is driven by Western sanctions and things like that. But you wind up with this sort of fragmentation of what otherwise would be, you know, the ideal sort of global operating model, and what that does is create multiple concentration risks in those locales, right? And even in what's left over, because you can't fail over to those places, right? For reasons of data privacy, for a whole host of reasons. And so you have these kind of, instead of one global model, you have a fragmented model, and each one is becoming more concentrated. The risk is becoming more concentrated in each place. Now, you know, the incident might only happen in one of those places, but where it does, you're kind of out of luck, because you can't rely on the resiliency of a global model the way, you know, maybe 10 years ago we would have been, we would have had more confidence in being able to fail over like that.
Sure. Yeah. No, thank you.
But I think that's being driven a lot by geopolitical situations.
Yeah.
That's a bigger driver for me on anything. You know, as you know, when I was sitting and we had to run I was trying to run a global network and run a global security group and run these pieces, you know, more and more we started to have to splinter things off because of the certain regimes felt that they could be able to dip into data. So what you started to do as a strategy is you created walled gardens, and then you did some reporting out on that. And that's something that I think a lot of people, if you're going to put your 3 to 5 year, you know, eyeglasses on, there's a couple of places where it's growing. It's happening. One, I've already been a guy who's had to sign paperwork and other things in a foreign country, which is uncomfortable, but I see everybody else following that model. It's sort of, because I think one of the challenges we saw was coming out of the Russia playbook. You know, when you had to extract people, technology, and a lot of pieces out of that, that was an eye opener for a lot of people in how to manage that situation. And I think you see the China playbook now looking on that, saying, I don't want to be caught in that position where now all of a sudden people are pulling technology out. You're going to use what we have locally. You're going to do these things, and we're going to kind of buffer ourselves with that. But it makes it hard when you're trying to manage a global system and have eyes on glass and see things. because of those disconnects that you're now facing.
Yeah, that's a good point.
The last topic I had on the external environment before we dive into inside the organization's four walls is around the regulatory backdrop. And David, yes, David, you brought up the concept of discontinuity of regulation. So I was hoping you'd expand on that concept. And I have my own feelings about the regulatory environment as it relates to this topic, but love to hear yours.
Yeah, so it's just so annoying, right? So a very quick example. Just got some draft regulation from the CFTC on operational resilience. This is a perfect chance for an interagency view on it. It's a long span between, you know, the white paper from 2004, but there's an this is a perfect situation where all of the acronyms could have gotten together over dinner and come up with an interagency view on operational resilience. And instead, what we're going to have is 6 of them within the United States. And you hope then that there is some logic, even just in the terminology that's used, right, between them. So at the very minimum, you're burning cycles to go ahead and do the parity analysis, okay? Just to say, all right, this acronym said X, this acronym says X prime, they're sort of the same, and then this acronym says Y, and now you've got to go ahead and do a mapping that makes no sense. So that's sort of at the very minimum is that analysis. At the other end of the spectrum is you've got to go manage a program within your own governmental framework, let's say, that is, you need essentially Babelfish or the Rosetta Stone to go ahead and make sure that the path you're traveling is the line of best fit between them all, or you're managing multiple programs within the same essential jurisdiction. We've seen it before. Every letter that we've written from a response that we've written from a sector point of view, whether it be through SIFMA or PHYSIC or back in the old days, the ISAC or BITS, has all said the same thing. Please all go sit down at the same acronym soup table and come up with something that you can all agree to. And it never happens. It hasn't, as far as I know, it happened in again, the 2004, it happened in that guidance document about OpRes when 3 of the acronyms, I think, came and said, okay, we'll be part, but that was just a guidance document. And it mostly was asking, how are you dealing with the Bank of England paper? And we were kind of like, wait, what? So this was a perfect, evolutionary step to go ahead off of the 2004 paper. And it's not going to happen. And I will climb off my soapbox because I'm short and I don't want to pull something.
Sorry, I had to read the comment that you get points for referencing Babelfish. So, Dan, do you have a different opinion, or are you seeing the same thing? I sympathize with David's comments.
Well, you have to empathize, frankly, because you're going to get hit by it too. So you have to
empathize. That's a good point.
Largely the same, right? I mean, in theory, the College of Regulators gets together, internationally, and is meant to sort of compare notes and converge a little bit. But this is not unique to this topic, right? I mean, we saw the same thing when they were all rolling out their cybersecurity requirements, probably 10 years ago now. We see the same thing on third-party requirements. So maybe it's exacerbated by the fact that operational resilience, integrates several of those different elements, and so it's like another order of magnitude to say, well, the complexities kind of overlap with one another. There are a few things to be hopeful about. I think the DORA regulation in the EU is meant to synchronize a little bit and streamline so 3 or 4 categories into a more coherent set of regulations. And I think especially in the context of the EU, that's going to be welcome. But even within the U.S., multiple major regulators just coming at it. They've got their own programs to kind of say something original and take a stance on one aspect or another, and so it's going to continue to be a challenge.
Well, I do. My only comment on it is I do know that FFIEC's Cybersecurity and Critical Infrastructure Working Group is trying to work on something. So, David, I don't know if that's going to materialize, but I know there's a desire to. It might be a few years. Brian, are you, given that KPMG obviously has visibility into a host of sectors, are you seeing any maybe differences in approach from a regulatory perspective for those heavily regulated industries, or and maybe there isn't the the alphabet soup as David was referring to,
Yeah,
acronyms.
I love financial services. You guys have no shortage of
a lot of
regulators. That's a business in its own, I have to say. I think what you're starting to see in other industries, whether you're looking at industrial manufacturing, right? Your chemical manufacturing, look at things like CFATs and all these other pieces about this. They're really coming to the realization they may not be dictating sort of a regulation around it, but I think they're all starting to realize it's something they have to do. And they're starting to self-select. Like when I'm sitting in the manufacturing world, they're really thinking through their OT issues. Operational technology has been something where they just hope it works, right? And if anybody's worked in that industry, you realize that sometimes you could breathe on that controller and it'll fall over. But it's critical to their manufacturing system, and I think for them that's where their focus is. So as you start to move across this, or even you go in telecommunications, they're the more good, but they rely on having it up and running because it's money if they don't have it running. You look at manufacturing, it's money if these things aren't done. You look at oil and gas, that's mission critical, right? You really look at the concentration of how we have refineries in the U.S. One or two goes out, and it's a bad situation. So I see a lot of that happening where they're deriving it more from they realize that if they can't make money or stay afloat if they don't do some of these things well. Now I'll say this much: are they great at these things? Because no, I think they're starting to learn better on how to run exercises, and I think they're starting to think about how do I run end-to-end exercises. Because they kind of, what I see a lot of it when the people are doing an exercise, they take this piece, test it. They take this piece, test it. They take this piece, test it. And they get A's across the board. You put it together, and all of a sudden you realize that the handoffs weren't as crisp as you thought they were. The people being available to know what the next step is and going. So we're working with a lot of clients. We're pushing to think end to end so that you don't go to the point of failure. You want to find the point of failure in the middle of a crisis. Is our mission.
What was going through my mind as you were describing that was, unfortunately, the SVB experience from last year and not having the end-to-end process tested and in place, which wasn't the only reason, but it certainly could have alleviated some of it. Moving into the inside of the organization, we'll spend a few minutes on that before we close out today's discussion. And looking at some of the maybe insights, thoughts, and maybe some best practices. But let me start with just a comment around, and it was two comments that were made. One from Kirsten, which was, I love this. And Mark, I'm glad you didn't use this quote because I wrote it down after she said it, relentless resilience. That was a really catchy quote. And if that mindset, were in place at every organization, it would be, I think, our endpoint. I think we have a ways to go before we get there. And then Phil's was move beyond defense to resilience. And interestingly, really capturing a lot of providing the minimum viable services in the face of attacks and disruptions. So adopting some of that similar language and concepts of the impact on the end user. And my question really is around, where do you think we are on that journey? So when we think about, maybe we'll start with critical infrastructure. When we think about where firms stand from the standpoint of recognizing the importance of resilience, not in place of, but in separate from or in addition to business continuity, So resilience really being that the desired endpoint. Are we 30% of the way there? Are we 60? Are we 75?
Well, I'd say
that's a little high.
Yeah, I know it is. That's why I at least threw it out there as a
there's no
bracket.
reaching 100% because the goalposts will keep moving, right? So it's a matter of trying to keep up with evolving risks and evolving kind of understanding of what the threat scenarios could look like. But I guess two things that I would ask about any sort of program of simulations and exercises. One is, are we testing the right scenarios? So what are you building your simulations around? Are these the most relevant, plausible, disruptive events that you really should be training? Because if we're training on the wrong things, then when it happens, you're still not prepared. And then another, this is not exclusive, but the other question, just as a thought starter, would be, are we involving right up to the senior most levels of leadership, right? If this thing escalates to a full-on crisis, to something that could be existential for the organization, have you trained each of the business unit leaders, the risk officer, honestly, the whole operating committee at one level or another needs to sort of have played their role in the simulations and exercises, because they're the ones who are going to be making the most critical decisions in those sort of extreme scenarios. So, if they haven't been brought in, and not just for one exercise a year or something, but on a more regular basis, then that would be a gap.
Yeah,
I'm
Brian,
going to follow on with Dan's point on that, though. I think, again, so everybody used to say cyber, right? That was the buzzword across levels, right? The way I judge an organization is if they can move from cyber and talk to resilience, right? Then I know that they're finally getting it. And I think as I was starting to work, particularly when we do a security incident response, we have a sort of bronze, silver, gold team, right? Gold team is your executive leadership, silver kind of manages, and bronze is actually trying to recover, repair. And I think what has to change a little bit on that from my mind is that when I work with executives up and down that layer, I'm amazed that sometimes when they're put under pressure, like what I try to do is this: when we do this and we come in, I say we can't have a very glad-handed way. When we do the rebriefs, everybody was cordial to each other, but it was nice. Everybody was having they're all complimenting each other on how well they stated something. I said, well, if you've been in a room like this and you're in crisis management, no one's complimenting anybody. And it's a very tense situation. So I think the more you get into sort of live fire type of situations and scenarios, and you put a little pressure on things, because out of pressure comes diamonds, right? So you got to deal with that. And you get people to recognize it, they start to really strap in and think about it. I find when you do these exercises where it's just something where they're going through the motions, they don't put their mind around it. So for me, on the inside, when I start to see executives really saying, hey, I know my role here, I know what I'm supposed to work on, and I'm taking action, then I think we've hit a bit of a good place.
Yeah, I'll add a couple things. One is I'll just say my past shop, a few things that we did to the point of you can never be 100% resilient. We had a fairly integrated and complex set of calculations that measured resilience at different levels of the firm. And I would only use 80%. And I got questioned by the board one time. They said, why are you only using up to 80%? And I said, because I got to imagine there's 20% I just don't know, right? So because all of the evolution, everything's constantly changing, and that was just always the ceiling was always going to be 80%. The other thing is that bring in something from before, we're talking about different tests, right? That were this portion of the process, and then this portion of the process, and then this portion of the process. So from an end-to-end point of view, the aggregate of those things doesn't equal the end-to-end. So the complexity of that exercise is the end-to-end. Having this widget tested and then add it to this widget and then add it to this widget, that aggregate doesn't necessarily give you the full point of view of what that end-to-end could look like under fire. The piece that I find that we are missing is when we do these exercises and the end-to-end, we tend to stay in the non-financial risk realm, right? But ultimately, no matter what you're in, and so Brian, you brought this up before, if manufacturing's down for a bit of time, you're losing money. If you know, the refinery, the oil and gas sector is down for a bit of time, losing money and things like that. So ultimately, the end-to-end of this needs to go beyond the NFR, the non-financial risk or the non-financial resilience, into, in the financial sector, it's could be frozen liquidity, right? And so now we're getting into the dollar sign and comma stuff, the credit market liquidity risk. And so what does that mean? And then you're truly getting now into the impact tolerance piece of it. So that end-to-end piece is, I would say, from a complexity point of view, shouldn't end in the NFR space. It should go further and to say, well, guess what? Each minute is this. By the way, you know, time of day, day of the week, week of the month all matter. So, you know, at these 3 or 4 times a year, this is what it looks like. And then these 2 or 3 times a year, this is what it looks like. But expanding it into the dollar sign and comma portion of the area, I think is truly getting into that end-to-end. So expanding that level of complexity, I think, is important.
And David, would you connect that to the sort of which scenarios are you testing in the first place? So, you know, our most critical operations there are a few criteria for defining them, right? But I mean, clearly they're the ones that are going to have the biggest financial impact, among other things. So a disruption that, you know, hits one or more of those, you know, directly, and then it's a question of, you know, how many minutes, how many hours is this going on, and what's happening, right? So.
And it depends too. I think pushing those against each other. We ran an exercise one time right before COVID at my old shop, which was actually it was very similar to what happened with the Industrial Bank of China very recently. So disconnect or close the day, right? So disconnect because you worry about contagion, and then not close the day and you're into a credit market liquidity element, or let it continue and close the day, and pushing those things against each other. Again, this was one of the most critical things. And I think that playing these scenarios, to your point, Dan, about pushing these things against each other, some things are more important on certain days, right? So the day after Thanksgiving is the biggest cash clearing day of the year, right? And so that's an important element for those cash clearing businesses. But certain parts of the day are also, you know, we all have these tier 1s, tier 2s, tier 3s, but some of it doesn't matter at another point in the day. So again, past world, the bond market, the fixed income market, obviously fairly big, low transactions, very large dollars. But I think after like 11 o'clock in the morning, like 87% of the day is like done. So if I have an incident where I've got to go ahead and marshal a finite amount of resources, I may, and it's 12:01, I may not focus on that thing. I may have to go ahead and marshal those resources to something else. So yeah, having those complex overlapping scenarios where you've got to go ahead and make those decisions is important.
So David, thank you for bringing up the, and I think each of you had brought up the, apologies to Brian. Brian did lose power.
Is he in the same place you're at?
I don't know. We're okay. Yeah, my building's okay. But so you know, I've heard the common theme across the conversations, I think, for each of the 3 of you, around the segmentation of either efforts or thought or analysis and preparation, and really stepping back and making sure there's a holistic view and an end-to-end either exercise or process or preparedness. And that brings me to, Dan, I think one of the concepts that you had brought up, which is around aggregation across risk stripes. So that's technology, third party, or security risks, and business processes. And I maybe we can close out, given that we're about 5 minutes from the top of the hour, with that as the capstone concept. Any thoughts that you'd like to add, just given David's comments that he just ended with?
Yeah, I mean, briefly, conceptually, I think I alluded to sort of there's the business resiliency stripe, then there's the technology resiliency stripe, there's the third party, right? Some places talk about like they've got sort of facilities resiliency as a separate stripe, right? There's security. So, and each of those things have their own reporting lines, and in principle, sort of they come together at some fairly senior level. But that doesn't mean that the coordination, the choreography really is what's needed kind of through the different levels of the organization. And that doesn't happen just because people want it to, all best intentions, right? But that's a very hard thing to actually pull off. So I think of one just concrete example having to do with a data center in a far off country where you have to have data centers there for, again, back to data privacy and other kind of local sort of jurisdictional reasons. But fortunately, you're able to outsource that to a third party, and so you've got a provider of data center services to any number of companies that are operating in country. And then the data center, of course, it has to do a proper sort of threat and vulnerability risk assessment. But fortunately, you can outsource that too, right? So you got a fourth party doing the TBRA. And it's a fourth party that's been signed off on by the regulator because they're also using the data center. So they say, these are the guys that we trust it. Well, at the end of all that, your own organization is relying on a TBRA that no one has looked at. No one in the organization, except maybe somebody in sourcing who has to check off that was done, right? But all of the in-house kind of knowledge you have about what you're really worried about and what your own standards are and all those kinds of things, they're sort of very far away from that situation. And so, all the right things are sort of happening on paper, but the right kind of bringing together of who's looking at the facilities risk, who's looking at this, the technology risk, who's looking at the security aspects, like those things they're too far removed from what actually has to happen to make sure that your data is where it ought to be and it's secure as you need it to be in that country.
Yeah, very well said.
Yeah, you can't see. Sorry, Trey. You can't see the risk, right? You have to have what I'll call intentionality around control parity, right? So you got to go ahead and say, this is the way we would do it in-house, and this is the way we've got to do it here. But if all of these things are supporting the critical process, whether it be people, places, or widgets, they need to all have the same sort of criticality and the controls that make them all equal. And you're right, as we get to more and more outsourcing and we're relying on other sets of eyes, ears, and whatever factors, but we're relying on those experts to go ahead and carry our flag, and probably there's plenty of things falling on the cutting room floor.
Nice. Great way to end today's call. Gentlemen, I appreciate all of your insights and also your firsthand experience with each of these topics. It's really helpful for everybody who's participating in this. Certainly was for me. So thanks again. Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Trey, and thanks, David, Brian, Dan. And just as a reminder to all of you, Mike Tyson's fighting again in July. I'd still consider him a threat. Nobody wants to get punched in the face by him. I hope we can work with industry and regulators to evolve the ORF into the centrally accepted methodology, bring us to those common acronyms that David was discussing. The purpose of industry-driven efforts like the ORF Working Group is to create that meeting of minds. Thanks to all of you. I'm sure anyone that's here on the journey to build operational resilience learned a lot. Thanks to all of you for sharing your strategies to deal with incidental, accidental outages, emerging threats, how to identify, prioritize your third and fourth party dependencies, all those items. And thanks to all of our speakers today for contributing to this event. I know I learned a lot over the course of the day. Before we close out, please consider becoming a member of the Business Resilience Council for daily insight into all source threats that could help protect your organization. If you'd like to attend an upcoming conference in person, we're hosting the 7th Annual Summit on Security and Third-Party Risk in Orlando in November. You can learn more about that at grf.org. Please mark your calendars and register early. We already have a great lineup of practitioner presenters, and we're adding to them weekly. Thanks again to all of you for joining us today. We hope you found this virtual summit informative and worthy of the time that you've given us. Thanks all.